Misogynistic boss fires woman for being pregnant. Her lawsuit shocks everyone. Maria Perez had always been a woman of determination. She'd spent years climbing the ranks in the corporate world, carving out a place for herself in industries where women were often dismissed or overlooked. As a senior project manager at Horizon Tech Solutions, she prided herself on her ability to lead her team through tight deadlines, complex negotiations, and impossible expectations. Her record spoke for itself. Every project she handled was delivered on time, under budget, and with results that exceeded client expectations. But none of that seemed to matter to her boss, Mr. William Green. Green had a reputation around the office. The whispers were always the same. He didn't like women who'd tried too hard. He'd once told a colleague in the break room that women were too emotional for leadership roles, a comment that had made its way around the office like wildfire. Most of the female employees avoided him as much as possible, keeping their heads down and their opinions to themselves. But Maria couldn't afford to be invisible. Her job required her to work directly with Green, and every interaction felt like a battle she had to win just to prove her worth. "Maria," Green said one morning during their weekly meeting, leaning back in his chair with an air of smugness, "I noticed your team missed the preliminary report deadline by 2 hours last week. Care to explain?" Maria bit back a sharp reply. The delay had been caused by a system crash, a technical issue entirely outside her team's control. She'd already sent a detailed explanation via email, but clearly, Green hadn't bothered to read it. "There was a server issue that caused the delay," she said evenly. "The IT department confirmed it, and we adjusted our schedule to ensure the final deadline won't be impacted." Green raised an eyebrow, his expression one of exaggerated skepticism. "You're making excuses, Perez. I need leaders who take accountability, not people who shift blame." Maria clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not shifting blame, sir. I'm providing context. The final deliverables will still meet the client's expectations." Green smirked, leaning forward. "We'll see about that. Just remember, you're only as good as your last project. Don't give me a reason to question why I hired you." Maria felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over her. She'd worked harder than anyone else on the team to earn her position, yet Green never missed an opportunity to undermine her. Still, she forced herself to remain calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help her case, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. A few weeks later, Maria received news that changed everything. She was pregnant. She and her husband, Carlos, had been hoping for this moment for months. The joy of seeing the positive test result was overwhelming, and for a brief moment, Maria felt invincible. But as the initial excitement wore off, reality set in. She would have to tell her boss. Maria wasn't naive. She knew Green wouldn't be thrilled about the news. He valued control above all else, and the idea of a senior project manager taking maternity leave would undoubtedly disrupt his carefully constructed plans. Still, Maria hoped he would at least be professional about it. After all, she had always delivered results, and her pregnancy wouldn't change that. She scheduled a meeting with Green the following morning, her heart pounding as she knocked on his office door. "Come in," he called, his tone as curt as ever. Maria stepped inside, clutching a folder of project updates to steady her nerves. Green barely glanced up from his computer. "What is it, Perez?" "I'm busy. I won't take much of your time," Maria began, forcing a smile. "I wanted to let you know that I'm pregnant. I'll be working with HR to plan my maternity leave, and I'll ensure there's a seamless transition for my projects during my absence." Green's fingers paused over his keyboard, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Pregnant," he repeated, his tone flat. "Yes," Maria said, her voice steady. "I wanted to inform you early so we can plan accordingly. I'll make sure my responsibilities are covered." Green leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "And how exactly do you expect to manage a team while dealing with that?" Maria blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. "I don't see why my pregnancy would interfere with my ability to do my job. I've always delivered results, and I don't plan to stop now." Green's smirk returned, colder this time. "You say that now, but we both know how this goes. You'll start missing deadlines, taking sick days, and before we know it, the entire department will be picking up your slack. I can't afford that kind of disruption. Maria felt her chest tighten. With all due respect, sir, my performance speaks for itself. I've never let my team or this company down. Until now, Green said sharply. Look, Perez, I'm running a business here, not a daycare. If you're not up to the task, maybe it's time to step aside. The words hit her like a slap. Maria stared at him, disbelief and anger bubbling to the surface. Are you firing me because I'm pregnant? Green shrugged, his expression indifferent. Call it what you want. I need people who can commit fully to their roles. If you can't do that, you're not a good fit for this company. Maria stood, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. This isn't over, she said, her voice low but resolute. Green smirked. Whatever you say, Perez. The next few days were a blur. Maria vacillated between anger, disbelief, and fear. How could this be happening? She had dedicated years of her life to Horizon Tech Solutions, only to be cast aside the moment her personal life didn't align with Green's expectations. But beneath the frustration, a new resolve began to form. She wouldn't let Green get away with this. She had rights, and she was determined to fight for them. Carlos was the first person she confided in. He listened quietly as she recounted the meeting, his jaw tightening with every word. This is illegal, he said finally. You can't just fire someone for being pregnant. Maria nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I know. But what can I do? It's his word against mine. Carlos placed a hand on hers, his grip firm and reassuring. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. That evening, Maria began researching workplace discrimination laws. She pored over articles, legal cases, and government websites, taking notes on everything that seemed relevant. The more she read, the more confident she became. Green had violated the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, a federal law that prohibited employers from treating pregnant workers unfairly. She had a case. She just needed someone to help her make it. The next morning, Maria made an appointment with a local employment attorney named James Holloway. He came highly recommended, known for his tenacity and willingness to take on powerful corporations. As she sat in his modest office, she recounted her story, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to bubble over. When she finished, James leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. This is a clear-cut case of discrimination, he said. But cases like this are never easy. Horizon Tech will fight tooth and nail to protect themselves. Are you ready for that? Maria met his gaze, her determination unwavering. I am. James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good. Then let's get to work. Maria's days turned into a whirlwind of preparation as she and James began building her case against Horizon Tech Solutions. Every detail, every interaction, every email she could recall became a potential piece of evidence. At first, it felt overwhelming, like trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were missing. But with James's guidance, Maria began to find her footing. Documentation is everything, James said during one of their meetings. His office was cluttered with case files, legal textbooks, and a coffee cup that seemed permanently glued to his desk. Do you have emails or performance reviews that demonstrate your contributions to the company? Anything that shows Green's behavior before and after your pregnancy announcement? Maria thought back to the countless hours she'd spent at the office, the late nights and weekends she'd sacrificed to meet deadlines. Green had rarely acknowledged her efforts, but she did have a handful of glowing performance reviews from other supervisors and even a few commendations from clients. I think I can dig up some emails and reviews, she said. But a lot of our communication was verbal. He rarely put anything in writing. James nodded, tapping his pen against his notepad. That's common in cases like this. Managers like Green know how to cover their tracks. But don't underestimate the power of circumstantial evidence. If we can establish a pattern of discriminatory behavior, it'll strengthen your case. Maria spent the next few days combing through her email archives, searching for anything that could support her claims. She found a thread from a senior executive praising her leadership on a high-profile project, another from a client thanking her for her outstanding professionalism, and even a memo from Green himself, grudgingly acknowledging her team's success on a difficult contract. As she forwarded the emails to James, a flicker of hope began to grow. Meanwhile, the fallout from Maria's firing was beginning to ripple through the office. Her co-workers, many of whom had admired her professionalism and leadership, were shocked by her sudden departure. Rumors swirled, fueled by Green's vague explanation that Maria had chosen to leave due to personal reasons. "Did you really quit?" her friend and former colleague, Angela, asked during a phone call one evening. Angela had been Maria's confidant at work, one of the few people who understood how difficult it was to navigate Green's hostility. "No," Maria said, her voice tight with frustration. "He fired me because I'm pregnant." Angela gasped. "Are you serious? That's disgusting. I knew Green was a jerk, but this? You're taking legal action, right?" "I am," Maria said, "but I could use your help. Do you remember any incidents where Green made inappropriate comments or treated women unfairly?" Angela hesitated. "There were a few times he said things that made me uncomfortable, but I don't know if I can go on the record. I need this job, Maria. I have bills to pay." Maria's heart sank, but she understood. Green's power extended beyond his position. He controlled people's livelihoods, and that made him dangerous. "I get it," Maria said softly. "But if you change your mind, let me know. Your voice could make a difference." As Maria's case began to take shape, James reached out to a key figure who could strengthen their argument. Sarah, a former employee of Horizon Tech who had left under mysterious circumstances a year earlier. Sarah had been a rising star in the marketing department, but her sudden departure had raised eyebrows. Rumors hinted at a falling out with Green, but no one knew the details. When Sarah agreed to meet with them, Maria felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. They met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of Horizon Tech employees. Sarah was a petite woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence. As she sat across from Maria and James, she took a deep breath before speaking. "Green forced me out," she said bluntly. "I didn't have the resources to fight him, so I took a severance package and left. But I've regretted it every day since." Maria leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What happened?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was up for a promotion, one I'd earned. But Green gave it to a less qualified male colleague instead. When I confronted him, he said something I'll never forget. 'You should be grateful I let you stay this long. Women like you always find a reason to quit eventually.'" Maria's stomach churned with anger. "Did you document any of this?" "I tried," Sarah said. "But like you, most of my interactions with him were verbal. I do have a few emails that might help, though." James nodded, his expression serious. "Anything you have could be valuable. And if you're willing to testify, it could make a huge difference." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to Maria. "Do you think it's worth it? Standing up to someone like Green?" Maria's voice was firm. "Yes. He's gotten away with this for too long. If we don't fight back, he'll just keep doing it." After a long pause, Sarah nodded. "All right, I'm in." As the weeks passed, the pieces of the case began to come together. James filed the lawsuit, alleging wrongful termination and pregnancy discrimination, and the news quickly spread. Horizon Tech's PR department scrambled to control the narrative, issuing a bland statement about their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But behind closed doors, Green was furious. Maria's former colleagues told her about the tense atmosphere at the office, where Green's temper had become even more volatile. He called emergency meetings to rally support from his team, insisting that the lawsuit was baseless and that Maria was just playing the victim. But not everyone was convinced. Angela, who had been quietly observing the chaos, finally decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She reached out to Maria with a surprising offer. "I've been thinking about what you said," Angela admitted during their second phone call. "And you're right. Green's behavior has gone unchecked for too long. I'm willing to testify." Maria felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Angela. This means so much to me." Angela's voice was resolute. "Don't thank me yet. Let's take him down first." When the court date arrived, Maria felt a mix of nerves and determination. She sat beside James in the courtroom, clutching her notes as the proceedings began. The defense team, representing Horizon Tech, painted Maria as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated her claims out of spite. But James countered with compelling evidence: the emails, Sarah's testimony, and Angela's detailed account of Green's discriminatory remarks. As the trial unfolded, Maria's story resonated with the jury. Her courage, combined with the damning evidence against Green, painted a clear picture of a toxic workplace culture that prioritized power over fairness. And when Green himself took the stand, his arrogant demeanor only reinforced the claims against him. James leaned over to Maria during a recess, his voice low but confident. "We're winning this." Maria nodded, her heart swelling with hope. For the first time in weeks, she felt like justice was within reach. The courtroom was silent as the defense wrapped up their opening statements. Maria sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, James exuded an air of calm confidence, though she knew the stakes weighed heavily on him as well. This wasn't just a fight for Maria, it was a stand against systemic discrimination in the workplace. The first few witnesses were employees of Horizon Tech, handpicked by the defense to paint Green in a favorable light. One after another, they described him as a tough but fair manager who demanded excellence from his team. But their rehearsed answers and nervous glances toward Green undercut their credibility, and James was quick to point out inconsistencies during cross-examination. By the third day of the trial, it was Maria's turn to take the stand. She felt a lump in her throat as she approached the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her moment to tell her story, to lay bare the injustice she had endured. James began his questioning with a steady, reassuring tone. "Maria, can you tell the court about your role at Horizon Tech and your relationship with Mr. Green?" Maria took a deep breath and began to speak. She described her years of dedication to the company, her leadership on countless successful projects, and the subtle but persistent hostility she had faced from Green. Her voice wavered slightly as she recounted the meeting where he had fired her, but she pushed through, determined to make her story heard. "What impact did Mr. Green's actions have on your career and personal life?" James asked, his gaze steady. Maria paused, her throat tightening. "Losing my job wasn't just a financial blow, it was a betrayal. I had given everything to that company, and to be dismissed so callously because of my pregnancy was devastating. It made me question my worth, my capabilities. But I realized that staying silent would only allow him to continue hurting others." James nodded, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Did you ever receive any indication from Mr. Green or Horizon Tech that your performance was inadequate?" "No," Maria said firmly. "In fact, my performance reviews were consistently positive, and my projects often exceeded expectations. The only thing that changed was my pregnancy." James turned to the jury, his expression resolute. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attorney wasted no time in trying to discredit Maria. He approached the stand with a smirk that made her stomach churn. "Ms. Perez," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that your team missed a deadline shortly before your termination?" "Yes," Maria said calmly, "but the delay was caused by a technical issue that was beyond my control. I informed Mr. Green and adjusted our schedule to ensure the final deadline was met." "And yet," the attorney pressed, "isn't it possible that Mr. Green viewed this as a failure of leadership on your part?" Maria's jaw tightened. "It's possible, but it doesn't align with his pattern of behavior. He made it clear during our meeting that my pregnancy was the issue, not my performance." The attorney chuckled, shaking his head. "So, we're supposed to believe that Mr. Green, a respected manager with years of experience, targeted you specifically because of your pregnancy?" "Yes," Maria said, her voice unwavering. "Because that's exactly what happened." The attorney leaned closer, his smirk widening. "Or perhaps you're using your pregnancy as an excuse for your inability to handle the demands of your role?" Maria's pulse quickened, but she refused to let him rattle her. "I handled the demands of my role just fine. My record speaks for itself." When Maria stepped down from the stand, James gave her an encouraging nod. She had held her ground, But the battle was far from over. The turning point came the next day when Sarah took the stand. Her testimony was damning, detailing Green's history of discriminatory remarks and his tendency to push out female employees who didn't fit his mold. The courtroom was tense as she recounted her own experience, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I loved my job at Horizon Tech," Sarah said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But Mr. Green made it clear that my gender was a liability in his eyes. He told me I wasn't cut out for leadership, even though my results said otherwise. When I tried to fight back, he forced me out." The defense attorney tried to poke holes in her story, but Sarah remained composed, her answers concise and confident. By the time she stepped down, it was clear the jury was beginning to see Green in a different light. The final blow came when Angela took the stand. She had been nervous about testifying, but her resolve hardened as she looked across the courtroom at Green, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. "Mr. Green has a history of undermining female employees," Angela said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He would make comments about women being too emotional or unreliable, and he never took our ideas seriously. When Maria announced her pregnancy, I knew what was coming. He didn't even try to hide his disdain." James leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Why did you decide to testify today, Angela?" Angela's gaze flicked to Maria, then back to the jury. "Because someone had to. People like Green thrive on fear and silence. But Maria showed me that standing up for what's right is worth the risk." As the trial drew to a close, James delivered a powerful closing argument, tying together the testimony, evidence, and patterns of behavior that painted Green as a man who prioritized his own biases over fairness and professionalism. The defense tried to counter with arguments about business efficiency and tough decision-making, but their case was thin in comparison. The jury deliberated for hours, but to Maria, it felt like days. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as the minutes dragged on. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions solemn. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would determine the outcome of Maria's fight. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Horizon Tech Solutions, guilty of wrongful termination and pregnancy discrimination." A wave of relief and vindication washed over Maria. Tears filled her eyes as she turned to James, who smiled and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Around the courtroom, murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Green's face was pale, his jaw tight as he stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The verdict sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Horizon Tech was ordered to pay a substantial settlement to Maria, and Green faced immediate termination. For Maria, the victory wasn't just about the money, it was about sending a message. She had stood up to injustice, and she had won. As she left the courthouse, flanked by her family and friends, Maria felt a sense of pride and purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for every woman who had been told she didn't belong, for every mother who had been forced to choose between her career and her family. And as she looked ahead, she knew this was only the beginning. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones outstretched as Maria emerged with James by her side. She had braced herself for this moment, knowing that her victory wasn't just personal, it was a story that resonated with millions of people. "Maria, how does it feel to win such a landmark case?" one reporter shouted. "What do you hope this verdict will change for working women?" another asked. Maria hesitated, overwhelmed by the sea of questions, but James leaned in and murmured, "This is your moment. Speak from the heart." Taking a deep breath, Maria turned to face the reporters. "This case wasn't just about me," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "It was about standing up to a culture that punishes women for choosing to build families while pursuing their careers. No one should have to choose between being a parent and being a professional. I hope this verdict sends a message to employers everywhere. Discrimination has no place in the workplace." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Maria felt a sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do, and more. Back at her home, Maria was greeted with a celebration organized by her husband, Carlos. Balloons and banners filled their living room, and the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafted from the kitchen. A small group of friends and supporters had gathered to congratulate her, their smiles and laughter filling the space with warmth. "You're a hero, Maria," Rosa, her neighbor and longtime friend, said as she handed Maria a plate of snacks. "Do you know how many women are going to feel empowered because of what you did?" Maria smiled, though the weight of the last few months lingered. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But knowing that it might make a difference, that makes it worth it." Carlos wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice filled with pride. "You didn't just win a case. You changed lives." Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of Maria's victory became increasingly apparent. Her story was picked up by major news outlets, and her inbox was flooded with messages from women across the country. Some shared their own experiences with workplace discrimination, while others thanked her for giving them the courage to speak out. One email stood out in particular. It was from a woman named Tasha, a single mother who had recently been fired after requesting maternity leave. "Your story gave me the strength to file my own case," Tasha wrote. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight back." Maria responded to as many messages as she could, offering encouragement and advice. She realized that her fight wasn't over, it had simply shifted to a new phase. She wasn't just a former employee seeking justice anymore. She was an advocate, a voice for change. Meanwhile, Horizon Tech was reeling from the fallout of the lawsuit. The settlement had been a blow, but the damage to their reputation was even worse. Clients began to question whether the company's values aligned with their own, and several high-profile contracts were canceled. Green, once a powerful figure within the company, had been unceremoniously dismissed, his name now synonymous with corporate malpractice. For Maria, it was a vindication of everything she had endured. But even as she celebrated the company's accountability, she couldn't help but wonder how many other workplaces harbored their own versions of green. The problem was bigger than one man, and the solution would require systemic change. One day, James called Maria with an unexpected proposal. "I've been approached by a few advocacy groups," he said. "They're interested in launching a campaign to raise awareness about workplace discrimination, and they want you to be the face of it." Maria was stunned. "Me? I'm not a public speaker, James." "You don't have to be," he assured her. "You just have to tell your story, the same way you did in court. You've already inspired so many people, this could be a chance to reach even more." Maria hesitated. The thought of stepping into the spotlight again was daunting, but the opportunity to make a real impact was hard to ignore. "I'll think about it," she said finally. A week later, Maria found herself standing on a stage at a packed community center, a microphone in her hand. The event was hosted by an organization that supported working mothers, and the room was filled with women from all walks of life. Some had brought their children, others wore name tags that identified them as small business owners, teachers, or healthcare workers. Maria took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces. "When I first decided to take legal action against my employer, I was terrified," she began. "I worried about what it would mean for my career, for my family, and for my future. But I also knew that staying silent would mean accepting an injustice that I couldn't live with." She went on to recount her journey, from the moment Green fired her to the day the jury delivered their verdict. As she spoke, she saw nods of understanding and heard murmurs of agreement. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. Afterward, women approached her to share their own stories. One woman, a nurse named Beth, hugged Maria tightly and said, "Because of you, I'm going to talk to my supervisor about the way I've been treated. I deserve better." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. For every person who stood up, the fight became a little easier, and the world became a little fairer. As the months passed, Maria's life began to settle into a new rhythm. She welcomed her baby girl, Sophia, into the world, and the joy of motherhood became her anchor. But even as she navigated the sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, she remained committed to her mission. With James's help, she founded an organization dedicated to supporting women who face discrimination in the workplace. The group provided legal resources, mentorship programs, and workshops on employee rights. It was her way of turning pain into progress, of ensuring that no one else would have to fight alone. One day, as Maria walked through her neighborhood with Sophia in her stroller, she spotted Angela sitting on a park bench. They hadn't seen each other since the trial, and Maria was delighted to catch up. "I heard about your organization," Angela said, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're doing amazing things, Maria." Maria smiled. "I'm just trying to make a difference. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Angela hesitated, then said, "You've inspired me. I've been thinking about starting a support group for women in our industry. A place where we can share our experiences and help each other navigate the challenges." "That's a fantastic idea," Maria said. "Let me know how I can help." As they talked, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for equality was far from over, but with every conversation, every connection, and every small act of courage, progress was being made. Months turned into a year, and Maria's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Her daughter, Sophia, was the light of her life, a bundle of joy and energy who filled every corner of her world with laughter. But alongside the demands of motherhood, Maria had stepped fully into her role as an advocate, balancing her personal life with a mission to fight workplace discrimination on a larger scale. Her organization, Equal Ground, had grown rapidly, gaining traction through word of mouth, social media, and partnerships with other advocacy groups. Women from across the country reached out to share their stories, seeking guidance and support. Some were heartbreaking, accounts of mothers who had been pushed out of their jobs, young women who had been denied opportunities, and employees who had endured years of hostility from bosses like Green. Maria listened to every story with compassion and determination, her resolve to make a difference growing stronger with each passing day. She worked tirelessly, hosting workshops, attending conferences, and even lobbying for legislative changes to strengthen protections for pregnant workers and working parents. One day, Maria received an email from a woman named Lila, a warehouse supervisor in a small Midwest town. Lila's message was straightforward but urgent. Her employer had recently implemented a new policy requiring all employees to work overtime shifts, with no exceptions for medical conditions or family responsibilities. Lila, who was 6 months pregnant, had been told that she would be terminated if she couldn't comply. "This feels wrong," Lila wrote. "But I don't know what to do. I can't afford to lose my job, and I'm scared to speak up." Maria's heart ached as she read Lila's words. She saw echoes of her own experience in the letter: fear, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness. But she also saw an opportunity to help someone in need. She picked up the phone and called Lila, her voice warm and steady as she introduced herself. "You're not alone in this," Maria assured her. "We're going to figure this out together." Over the next few weeks, Maria worked closely with Lila, connecting her with legal resources and helping her document the company's discriminatory practices. They crafted a plan to address the issue internally, and when the company refused to budge, Maria encouraged Lila to speak publicly about her experience. The story gained national attention, sparking outrage and leading to a corporate investigation. Within months, the company reversed its policy and implemented new accommodations for pregnant workers. Lila's courage had made a difference, not just for herself, but for countless others who would benefit from the changes. When Lila called Maria to share the news, her voice was filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. Maria smiled, her own eyes misting with tears. "You did the hard part, Lila. You stood up when it mattered." As Equal Ground grew, Maria found herself busier than ever. She was invited to speak at events, where her story resonated with audiences of all backgrounds. She appeared on television panels, participated in policy discussions, and even worked with lawmakers on drafting a bill to expand protections for pregnant employees. One of the most memorable moments came when Maria was invited to testify before Congress. The hearing was part of a broader effort to address workplace inequality, and Maria's role was to provide a first-hand account of the challenges faced by women in the workforce. Sitting before the committee, Maria felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. She glanced down at the notes she had prepared, then looked up, meeting the eyes of the lawmakers before her. "My name is Maria Perez," she began, her voice steady. "I'm a mother, an advocate, and a former employee who faced discrimination simply because I chose to have a family. My experience is not unique. Across this country, countless women are forced to choose between their careers and their families, and that's a choice no one should have to make." She went on to share her story, weaving in the stories of others she had helped through Equal Ground. Her words were powerful and raw, leaving the room silent as she concluded. "We have the opportunity to create a better future," she said. "A future where women can thrive in their careers without fear of retaliation, where mothers are valued for their contributions, and where every worker is treated with dignity and respect. I urge you to take action, not just for me, but for the millions of women who deserve better." The committee members nodded, some even applauding her testimony. For Maria, it was a moment of validation, a sign that her voice was being heard. At home, Maria's life was as vibrant as ever. Sophia had taken her first steps, and Carlos was her rock, providing unwavering support as Maria balanced her advocacy work with motherhood. The two of them often joked that Sophia was destined to be a lawyer, given how much time she spent watching Maria prepare for meetings and events. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Carlos handed Maria a small envelope. "This came in the mail today," he said, his tone curious. Maria opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. As she read, her breath caught. It was from a former colleague at Horizon Tech, a woman named Emily who had always kept her head down, avoiding confrontation with Green. In the letter, Emily apologized for not speaking out sooner, admitting that fear had kept her silent. "You gave me the courage to find my voice," Emily wrote. "I recently confronted my manager about some unfair practices, and for the first time, I felt like I had the power to make a difference. Thank you for leading the way." Maria folded the letter carefully, her heart swelling with emotion. She looked at Carlos, her eyes shining. "This is why I keep fighting," she said softly. The impact of Maria's work continued to ripple outward. Equal Ground launched new initiatives, including mentorship programs for young professionals and training workshops for employers. The organization's annual conference became a gathering place for advocates, legal experts, and employees looking to make their workplaces more equitable. One year, Maria invited Sarah and Angela to speak at the conference, their stories serving as a reminder of the courage it took to stand up against injustice. The three women had become close friends, bonded by their shared fight and their determination to create change. As Maria watched Sarah and Angela address the audience, she felt a deep sense of pride. Together, they had turned their pain into progress, their struggles into strength. And while the fight was far from over, they knew they were making a difference, one step at a time. One evening, as Maria tucked Sophia into bed, she reflected on how far she had come. The road had been difficult, filled with challenges and sacrifices, but it had also been rewarding in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had found her purpose, her voice, and a community of people who believed in her vision. As Sophia drifted off to sleep, Maria whispered softly, "This is all for you. For your future. For every little girl who deserves to grow up in a world where she can dream without limits." And with that, Maria closed the door to Sophia's room, ready to face whatever the future held. Maria's work at Equal Ground had become a full-time mission. The organization had expanded beyond her wildest dreams, evolving from a grassroots effort into a national movement. She now had a small but dedicated team working with her, lawyers, advocates, communications experts, and volunteers, all united by the shared goal of creating fair workplaces for everyone. They operated out of a modest office in the city, its walls adorned with posters bearing empowering slogans like, "Equality isn't optional" and "Every voice matters." Despite the growing demands of the organization, Maria made it a point to stay involved with the people they helped. She personally responded to emails and attended meetings with women who were scared, angry, and unsure of their next steps. She saw herself in every one of them and knew that her role wasn't just to provide legal advice, it was to remind them of their strength. One afternoon, Maria sat across from a young woman named Aisha, who had been working as a paralegal at a prestigious law firm. Aisha had recently discovered she was pregnant and was now facing pressure to resign from her position. Her supervisor had been subtle but persistent, suggesting that her priorities might shift and hinting that the firm needed someone fully committed. "I feel like they're pushing me out," Aisha said, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to leave. I love my job." Maria reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on Aisha's. "You don't have to leave," she said firmly. "What they're doing is illegal, and you have every right to stand your ground. We'll support you every step of the way." Aisha's eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means so much to know I'm not alone." As Maria continued her work, her name began to appear in headlines more frequently. She was invited to speak at universities, legal summits, and even international conferences. Her speeches were passionate and unfiltered, drawing on her own experiences as well as the countless stories she had heard from women across the country. At one such event, a panel discussion on workplace equity, Maria found herself sitting beside high-profile executives and policymakers. The moderator, a seasoned journalist, turned to Maria with a probing question. "Maria, your work has sparked significant conversations about workplace discrimination, but some critics argue that companies are now walking on eggshells, afraid of being sued for every decision they make. How would you respond to that?" Maria took a moment to gather her thoughts. She was used to these kinds of questions, but they never failed to frustrate her. "I would say this," she began, her voice measured but firm. "Companies shouldn't be afraid of accountability, they should embrace it. If a workplace culture is built on fairness, respect, and inclusion, there's nothing to fear. The problem arises when leaders like my former boss use their power to silence, exclude, or harm others. Accountability isn't a burden, it's a responsibility." The audience erupted in applause, and Maria felt a surge of gratitude. It wasn't always easy to confront these challenges head-on, but moments like this reminded her why she had chosen this path. Despite her growing influence, Maria remained grounded. She cherished the quiet moments at home with Carlos and Sofia, who was now a curious and energetic toddler. Carlos often joked that Sofia had inherited Maria's fiery determination, a trait that revealed itself every time she insisted on doing things her own way. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Carlos handed Maria a flyer he had picked up at a community center. It was for a mentorship program aimed at young women entering the workforce. "I thought this might be something Equal Ground could get involved with," Carlos said, his tone thoughtful. "You've done so much for women facing discrimination, what if you started working on prevention too?" Maria studied the flyer, her mind racing with possibilities. "That's a great idea," she said. "If we can reach women early in their careers, we can empower them to recognize their rights and advocate for themselves before problems arise." The next day, Maria brought the idea to her team, and within weeks, Equal Ground had launched a pilot mentorship program. The initiative paired young professionals with experienced mentors who could provide guidance on navigating workplace challenges, building confidence, and setting boundaries. The program was an instant success, with dozens of women signing up within the first month. As the years passed, Maria's work continued to evolve. Equal Ground's annual conference became one of the most anticipated events in the advocacy world, drawing speakers and attendees from across the globe. The organization also launched a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing higher education, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't stand in the way of their dreams. But for all the progress Maria had made, there were still moments of doubt and exhaustion. Late at night, when Sofia was asleep and the house was quiet, Maria would sometimes sit at her desk, staring at the mountain of paperwork in front of her. The weight of the fight could feel overwhelming, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was doing enough. One such night, Maria received a message that reignited her resolve. It was from a woman named Elena, who had attended one of Equal Ground's workshops a year earlier. Elena had been working in a toxic environment, but with the tools and confidence she had gained from the workshop, she had successfully negotiated a promotion and implemented changes that improved the culture for her entire team. "Because of you," Elena wrote, "I realized my voice mattered. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Maria sat back in her chair, tears pricking her eyes. Moments like these reminded her that change was possible, even if it came one step at a time. One day, Maria was approached by a filmmaker who wanted to create a documentary about her journey and the impact of equal ground. The project was ambitious, aiming to shed light on workplace discrimination while celebrating the resilience of those who had fought back. At first, Maria hesitated. The idea of reliving her own struggles on camera was daunting, and she worried about the added attention it might bring. But after discussing it with Carlos and her team, she decided to move forward. If this documentary can inspire even one person to stand up for themselves, Maria said, then it's worth it. The filming process was both challenging and cathartic. Maria revisited the events that had led to her lawsuit, reflecting on how far she had come since those early days of fear and uncertainty. The documentary also featured stories from other women who had been helped by Equal Ground, their voices painting a powerful picture of the movement's impact. When the documentary premiered at a film festival, Maria sat in the audience, her heart pounding as the opening scenes played on the screen. By the end of the film, there wasn't a dry eye in the theater. The applause was thunderous, and as Maria took the stage for a Q&A session, she felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. Back at home, Maria hung a framed poster from the documentary premiere on the wall of her office. It was a reminder of everything she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for the countless women whose lives had been touched by her work. As she sat at her desk, Sophia toddled into the room, clutching a crayon and a piece of paper. "Look, Mommy," she said, holding up her drawing. It was a stick figure portrait of Maria, standing tall with a big smile. Maria laughed, pulling Sophia into her lap. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Is this me?" "Yep," Sophia said proudly. "You're helping people?" Maria kissed the top of Sophia's head, her heart swelling with love. "That's right," she said softly. "And I'll keep helping as long as I can."